Hey everybody. Um, this is the first section after the introduction from a chapter from Iring Fetscher's book Marx and Marxism. The chapter is titled From the Philosophy of the Proletariat to Proletarian Weltanschauung. The first section that I'm reading now is Elimination of the contrast between materialism and idealism and the conscious action of the proletariat. So here we go. Quote, "You cannot abolish philosophy without realizing philosophy," end quote. Karl Marx, Introduction to a Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right. Karl Marx stands at the end of the bourgeois epoch. In Karl Marx's own interpretation, Marx follows on the completion of bourgeois self-understanding in German philosophy and classical British political economy. Marx's task could only be to abolish, preserve, and elevate all three meanings are contained in the Hegelian term, quote, Aufheben, end quote, tradition and transcend the, quote, narrow horizon, end quote, of the bourgeois world in and through action. This, quote, Aufhebung, end quote, presupposes an appropriation and penetration of tradition which, quote, understands the latter better than its own exponents have understood it, end quote. Dialectical transcendence develops, quote, new principles for the world out of the principles of the world, end quote. It starts with the immanent and raises it beyond itself by achieving consciousness. But what is this bourgeois reality, and this bourgeois reality is complementary ideology, and how can it be transcended? Bourgeois ideology is a false reflection of a false reality. Footnote. Marx, when talking of bourgeois ideology, is not so much concerned with Hegel's philosophy as with the philosophy of the Hegelians of his own age. End footnote. Okay, where am I? Sorry, I spaced out for a second there. Bourgeois ideology is a false reflection of a false reality. It is neither the true reflection of a false world nor the false reflection of a true world. In bourgeois ideology's double falsity, there is still, however, no dialectical abolition of falseness as such, but the demand that this false reality should be made a, quote, correct, end quote, reality on the basis of which real truth will become possible. Bourgeois ideology is more closely marked by its idealism, by a doctrine which makes the idea into an independent factor isolated from reality and sees in it the driving force for socio-historical development. This ideology, in the stricter sense, is false in two aspects. A, the isolation of the ideal into a substance which is independent of historical totality is absolutely false in itself. B, the assertion that the ideal consciousness is the genuine historical driving force is relatively false with reference to the reality with which it is concerned. The absolute falseness could theoretically be eliminated by an ideological correction if it were not a necessary consequence of the relative falseness, which cannot be corrected without a correction of the reality which it reflects, which at the same time drives it on. The reality of the bourgeois capitalist world is false because in it, objective material processes, which are independent of man's knowledge and will, determine the fate of man, while man as a species being produces his own being and himself as species. Footnote. See Marx Capital, Volume 1, quote, "The mysterious nature of commodities consists simply in the fact that commodities reflect back to men the social character of men's own work as the objective character of the products of work, themselves as the social natural characteristics of these things, and therefore present the social relationship between producers and their labor as a whole as a social relationship of objects existing outside themselves. Through this quid pro quo, the products of labor become commodities, ... It is only the specific social relationship between men themselves which assumes here the phantasmagorical form of a relationship between things. To find an analogy, we must therefore fall back upon the nebulous region of the religious world. In the religious world, the products of the human brain seem to be independent beings endowed with a life of their own, and related to each other as well as to men. So it is with the products of human hands in the world of commodities. This I call the fetishism which attaches to the products of work as soon as the products of work are produced as commodities, ... End quote. Quote, just as man in religion is dominated by the products of his own brain, so in a system of capitalist production, man is dominated by the products of his own hands, end quote. The same idea also appears in the third volume of Capital. Quote, ultimately the worker, ... in fact, views the social character of his work, ... as a force which is alien to him, ... End quote. Quote, this is how the power of capital grows. The independence of the social production conditions personified in the capitalist by comparison with the real producer. Capital appears more and more as a social force, with the capitalist as capital's functionary, ... but as the alienated independent social force which faces society, ... as matter, end quote. Where am I? Sorry. I was pressing down when I should have been pressing up. Up when I should have been pressing down. In the early works, we encounter repeatedly the notion of alienation and domination of the reified social conditions over man. I shall merely quote two extremely typical passages. Quote, finally, it is necessary, ... for landed property in the form of capital, to show landed property in the form of capital's dominance both over the working class, and over the owners themselves. The medieval proverb, quote, nul terre sans seigneur, end quote, is then replaced by a different proverb, l'argent n'a pas de maître, end quote, expressing the dominance of dead matter over man. End quote. Quote, the alienation of the worker from the product of his work not only means that his work becomes an object or an external existence, but that his work exists outside of him. His work exists outside him, independently and foreign to him, and becomes an independent force which stands up against him. So that the life with which he has endowed the object faces him in hostility as an alien force, end quote. Most of the italics by Iring, Fetscher, it says. And footnote. A new footnote. See political economy and philosophy. I think that's how he's saying the economic and philosophical manuscripts. Quote, but since for socialist man the whole of so-called world history is nothing other than the production of man by human work, the development of nature for man, socialist man has the evident irrefutable proof of socialist man's birth by himself, of socialist man's process of formation, end quote. Italics by Iring, Fetscher. Just so you know, if I haven't said this in other videos, you've never heard me say this, when I repeat something, that means it was in italics. End footnote. In other words, the bourgeois capitalist world is false because the bourgeois capitalist world involves alienation, and because it is the result of the conscious individual actions of all isolated individuals, is alienated and reified into a material power hostile to individuals. The relative falseness of the bourgeois ideology is therefore based on the fact that it asserts of the false world that it is all right, and that it conceals the defectiveness of the false world by making the reified superior power of material conditions into an independent ideal factor, and thus spiritually reconciling men with it. Hegel, end parenthesis. Marx's first step consists in the criticism of the bourgeois ideological concealment of the aforementioned false bourgeois capitalist world. The critical removal of the veil is the prerequisite for the abolition of the defectiveness of ideology and reality. It allows action to appear at once and one and the same time as necessary and possible. The necessity of action is based morally on the falseness demonstrated in the bourgeois capitalist social order which alienates each individual, and factually on the need of the proletariat which is forced through its work to experience this alienation from humanity to the point of starvation. Oh shit, I fucked up. I didn't finish reading that last footnote. So back to the old footnote I was reading, but the part that I didn't read. The quote, species existence, end quote, of man consists in the fact that he must first develop this essence by quote, objectifying, end quote, himself. This objectification is the collective work of civilization and the labor of socialized humanity on the given cultural milieu. Man comes into man's own only when man is able to appropriate for himself all aspects of this objectified world. And take it into his possession. Only by this process does nature come to exist, quote, for him, end quote. Only in the process of historical humanization can he create for himself human meanings or, quote, senses, end quote, which enable human appropriation to take place. This relation becomes clear for the first time from the standpoint of the proletariat, because now the veil of alienation is cast off and the whole of reality, the totality of the human historical world, is not merely understood as man's own action, but consciously implemented. Since the special characteristic of man consists in the fact that man's human action is transmitted via the consciousness, man comes fully into his own only in the proletariat, where before he lived an alienated life. Man is a, quote, communal being, end quote, as a being which recognizes its oneness with the community, therefore embodies, according to Marx, absolute sovereign freedom, and thus fulfills an ideal which Marx tacitly takes over from the philosophical tradition. Okay, it's the end of that footnote for real this time. Where am I? And the reason okay. The possibility of action is based on the fact that this false alienated world, albeit unconsciously, is still a world created by men themselves. It is simply necessary to explain to men that through their activity men are themselves creating the alienating forces to show men the means to overcome this alienation. At the moment they become aware of the fact that alienation results from their own alienated action, they have also acquired the capability, but only as soon as it is really a case of the self-conscious class, to overcome it by a different form of action. This action, which overcomes alienation, cannot, however, be individual action. Since the conscious actions of isolated individuals finally led to the unintentional result which Marx called alienation, only a conscious interaction, a collective action with an appropriate collective consciousness, can overcome alienation. The social groups, or the bourgeois bourgeois capitalist world, are classes which differ not through different legal status, but through differing economic functions. positions within the relations of production, the proletariat is distinguished from other classes in bourgeois society by the fact that the proletariat suffers from the alienation created by the proletariat, while the bourgeoisie at the same time enjoys the fruits of this alienation and cannot therefore become aware of the social causes of the, quote, discontents of civilization, end quote, Freud. Footnote, quote, It must first be noted that everything which appears to the worker as activity of alienation and reification appears to the non-worker, i.e. the bourgeois, Iring, Fetscher, as a state of reification and alienation, end footnote. The suffering of the proletariat is therefore an essential prerequisite for the process of gaining consciousness, which should lead to a revolutionary change, to collective action. The second stage in Marxist theory is the actual defeat of the false world, and with it the false ideology of the bourgeoisie. This defeat cannot consist in turning the false world upside down, since it would not then cease to be false, but only in replacing the unconsciously produced false world by a consciously produced correct world. The process, or rather the action, by which the false world of capitalism is corrected and capitalism's false reflection eliminated, is that of the revolution led by a proletariat which has become conscious of itself. If in the proletariat which is conscious of itself and acts collectively on the basis of this consciousness, the division and isolation of the ideal, conscious, and material living objective aspects which were characteristic of bourgeois ideology are overcome. At the same time, however, that alienation is also overcome which had caused objective processes which were not and could not be controlled by the consciousness of man to determine the latter's fate. In other words, consciousness ceased to be, quote, idealistic, end quote, ideological in the moment when the social reality ceased to be, quote, materialistic, end quote. Footnote. We see here how naturalism or humanism, which is accomplished, differs both from idealism and from materialism, and it is at the same time a truth which unites both. Idealism and materialism, which unites both idealism and materialism, end quote. Marx. Quote, It can be seen how subjectivism and objectivism, spiritualism and materialism, activity and suffering, lose their conflict and therefore their existence as such conflict only in the new, Iring, Fetscher, end bracket, social condition, end quote. Lose their conflict and therefore their existence as such conflict only in the new social condition, end quote. End footnote. In the collective conscious action of the proletariat, the, quote, idea, end quote, becomes, quote, gestalt, end quote, or action, and the, quote, matter, end quote, history becomes conscious, or more accurately, conscious of itself. There is now no longer any isolated, quote, ideology, but only the conscious proletariat extending to the whole of society, acting at the same time on the basis of this consciousness. To some extent, therefore, the relative falseness of the bourgeois ideology becomes truth through the change in reality, since it is now the consciousness, the historical consciousness of men, which determines men's fate. However, it is the class consciousness of the proletariat united in their revolutionary practice which exists beyond the bourgeois capitalist world, but not in a remote, quote, paradise, end quote, of ideas. In this consciousness, in this conscious action, men prove, confirm, and achieve men's being, which men therefore no longer attempt to project into the transcendental as an idea or absolute spirit. In their collective action, they transcend themselves. Instead of a, quote, remote heaven, end quote, they produce a humanized world which they are able to appropriate for themselves in a universal manner. Footnote. Quote, man appropriates his universal essence in a universal manner, i.e. as a total man. All his human relationships with the world, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, feeling, thinking, perceiving, realizing, wishing, acting, loving, in short, all the organs of his individuality, like the organs which are immediately common in their form, are the appropriation of the object in their objective relationship to this object. In their objective relationship to this object. Appropriation of human reality its conduct in relation to the object, is the activation of human reality, ... human reality, end quote. End footnote. Where am I? Humanity humanizes humanity itself with a full consciousness of humanity's action, and therefore rationally and consciously completes the historical process which comprises all reality. Whereas previous history was only history to the extent that man arose through and in it, it now becomes the actual history of man, because in the proletariat humanity has become its conscious subject without ceasing to be at the same time the quote object, end quote, or more accurately the quote matter, end quote, substance of history. Footnote, quote, ... the movement of history, ... which is not yet the real history of man as an assumed subject, but first an act of generation, the history of development of man, end quote. Marx. End footnote. The proletariat therefore becomes the real subject-object of history. Lukács, quote, according to the prophetic words of Vika, we have made our own history ourselves, and if we are able ... to consider all of reality as history, we have in fact raised ourselves to the point at which reality can be considered as our own action fact. Tathandlung, end quote, Lukács. The activist philosophy of the young Marx and of Georg Lukács culminates in this idea. That Lukács quotes from History and Class Consciousness. It must be recognized at the outset that such a philosophy is both conceivable and in itself rational. It involves a, quote, continuation, end quote, of Hegelian thought on a higher level. If the historical movement is not only to be, quote, sublimated, end quote, retrospectively, also consciously shaped in the future, the contemplative identification with the, quote, world spirit, end quote, must be replaced by a subject-object which comprises and shapes the whole of socio-human reality. The spirit is replaced by the spirit's incarnation in the proletariat. Just as the objective meaning of the historical process reaches consciousness in the thinker who completes in himself the movement of thought which carries this process, so the meaningful development of the socioeconomic history of man, which has previously been, quote, suffered, end quote, unconsciously becomes conscious action in the revolutionary action of the proletariat. The proletariat which acts consciously accepts at one and the same time the meaning of past history and its own historical action which fulfills this meaning. Marx ascribes the decisive role in world history to the proletariat for three reasons. First, Marx assumes that the proletariat would become increasingly numerous because of the laws of development of capitalist society and one day would represent the majority of the world's population. Secondly, Marx saw in the increasing tension between human consciousness on the one hand and the actual reification and alienation of proletarian existence, the type of existence of the wage earner, the cause of a trouble which would lead inevitably to action. The trouble was one which touched the very roots of man's existence and therefore could be cured only by a radical revolution which would rid all reality of reality's alienation and therefore humanize reality. Thirdly, Marx expected real cooperation between the workers necessitated by technical reasons in spite of all the corruption brought about by the capitalist system and the capitalist system's individual egotistical ideologies to lead to a certain measure of solidarity and comradeship which would predispose the class towards genuine collective action. The first reason is socio-economical, the second metaphysical, or even, quote, theological, end quote, and the third psychological. Even if Marx's main work serves in the first instance to show the, quote, natural, end quote, tendencies of the breakdown of capitalist society, it still includes the doctrine of alienation, the causes of which are apparent in the conditions under which the workers live. Footnote. And it's just a citation of Capital Volume 1. End footnote. After 1846, the emphasis of Marx's work shifted more and more towards the socio-economic foundation of his philosophy of the proletariat. The unifying thought remained in the background and was not recognized by many of his contemporary socialists among them. This state of affairs, which we have necessarily only sketched in, must be kept in mind if we are to understand the significance and causes of the development of a comprehensive philosophical doctrine of Marxism by Engels, Deatskin, Lenin, and his followers. For Marx, an understanding of the historical process which covers all reality was accompanied by the seizure of power by the proletariat, which thereby becomes the subject-object of history. The dialectical theory of evolution developed by Engels and Lenin forms the unifying Weltanschauung of the party organization of the proletariat and elements of the living consciousness of the latter into a, quote, ideology, end quote. This naively realistic epistemology of Deatskin and Lenin is just as symptomatic of this process of the destruction of the unity between the subject and object as the emphasis on the dialectical proceeding in stages, unity of nature and the historical world, which is no longer, quote, mediated, end quote, by the living action of men, but essentially understood from this standpoint of matter, that is purely from the position of the object. After Marx, the great dialectical transformation took place through the interpenetration of reality, which forces its way through to thought, and thought which forces through to reality. In the encounter between philosophy and the proletariat, of the self-awareness which becomes action, and the socio-economic process which comes to awareness. Footnote, quote, it is not sufficient for the thought to press for realization. For realization, reality must itself force through to thought. Reality must itself force through to thought. Next footnote, quote, the head of this emancipation, bracket, of Germans to the conditions of men, Iring, Fetscher, end bracket, is philosophy, and the proletariat its heart. Philosophy cannot be realized without the transcending of the proletariat, and the proletariat cannot be transcended without the realization of philosophy, end quote. Marx, end footnote. In place of this coming into its own of the totality, we have in Engels the unending process of evolution with its qualitative stages, which are, it is true, interpreted in dialectical terms. The progressive elimination of the revolutionary function of consciousness and of the category of totality is characteristic of the development of dialectical materialism from its early stages up to the late work of Stalin. The development is traced below. Okay, that's the end of this section. The next section is titled The Development of Dialectical Materialism by Friedrich Engels. Thank you for listening.